A young man stands in a cramped attic room in Leipzig, staring at a flask of bubbling chemicals. It's 1768, and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe is convinced he's about to discover the secret of creation itself. He won't. But this failure, this obsessive search for hidden truths in test tubes and ancient texts, will shape everything he becomes. The greatest mind Germany ever produced started here, in frustration and fevered curiosity. Frankfurt am Main, August 28th, 1749. The house on Hirschgraben Street is unremarkable from the outside, but inside something extraordinary has just happened. A boy is born, barely breathing, essentially dead. The midwife and doctor work frantically. They shake him, slap him, try everything. Finally, a gasp. Johann Wolfgang Goethe enters the world fighting for his first breath, a struggle he'll later see as symbolic of his entire existence. His father, Johann Caspar Goethe, is a man of rigid discipline and thwarted ambition. He'd earned a doctorate in law, travelled through Italy, and returned to Frankfurt, expecting a prestigious career. Instead, he found himself sidelined, never achieving the positions he believed he deserved. So he turned his energy inward, toward his home, his collections, his children. The house became his kingdom, organised with Germanic precision. Every book catalogued, every painting positioned just so, every hour of the day structured. His mother, Katharina Elisabeth, called Frau Eyer by the family, couldn't be more different. She's 17 when Wolfgang is born, barely more than a girl herself, full of warmth and stories and spontaneous joy. While her husband broods over legal texts, she fills the house with laughter, tells fairy tales, makes everything an adventure. Wolfgang adores her. Years later, he'll write that from his father, he inherited his serious approach to life, but from his mother, his joy in storytelling. Frankfurt itself is a peculiar place for a boy to grow up. It's a free imperial city, answering to no prince or duke, only to the distant emperor. The city pulses with commerce, with travellers, with the constant flow of new ideas and foreign goods. The Jewish ghetto sits cramped and restricted, yet its scholars debate in Hebrew and Yiddish. French refugees bring their language and culture. The annual autumn fair transforms the city into a carnival of merchants from across Europe. Wolfgang's childhood is privileged, but not idle. His father designs a comprehensive education, hiring tutors for languages, music, drawing, fencing, dancing, riding. By age 8, Wolfgang reads Latin, Greek, French, Italian, and Hebrew. He writes little plays and performs them with his sister Cornelia, his closest companion in these early years. She's sharp, curious, trapped by the limitations placed on women, and Wolfgang senses this unfairness even as a child. But privilege has its suffocations. The house on Hirschgraben is controlled, proper, measured. Every action scrutinized by a father who demands excellence. Wolfgang learns to perform, to present the dutiful son, while his inner life roams wild and free. He discovers early that he contains multitudes, that the face shown to the world and the chaos of genuine feeling rarely align. The 7 Years' War intrudes on this ordered existence. French troops occupy Frankfurt in 1759, and a French official, Count Torrance, is billeted in the Goethe household. Wolfgang is 10 years old, and suddenly his home contains this exotic creature, a representative of sophisticated French culture. The Count commissions paintings, hosts theatrical performances, brings artists and actors into the house. Wolfgang's father seethes at the occupation, but Wolfgang is mesmerized. He watches everything, absorbs it all. Then comes the first artistic obsession, a puppet theatre, a gift that becomes an all-consuming passion. Wolfgang doesn't just play with it. He writes plays for it, creates entire worlds in miniature. The biblical story of Joseph and his brothers, tales of knights and romance. He performs them for family, for visitors, refining his stagecraft, learning how stories work, how to hold an audience. Religion threads through his childhood in complicated ways. His father is Lutheran, but not particularly devout. His mother is more spiritual, more emotional in her faith. Wolfgang attends services, learns his catechism, but even young, he senses something incomplete in the official doctrines. The God presented in church seems small, limited, too concerned with rules and punishment. Wolfgang's mind reaches towards something vaster, more mysterious. In 1763, something shifts. The 14-year-old Wolfgang witnesses the coronation of Joseph II as Holy Roman Emperor, a spectacle of medieval pageantry in Frankfurt's ancient cathedral. The ceremony is magnificent, absurd, deeply moving, and somehow hollow all at once. Wolfgang watches the elaborate ritual, the nobles in their finery, the pretense of universal empire over a fractured Germany. He's beginning to see the gap between symbol and reality, between what institutions claim and what they deliver. His education continues, relentless and broad. His father insists on practical knowledge alongside cultural refinement. Wolfgang learns about mining, about administrative procedures, about how the world actually functions beyond books. But literature is where his heart lives. He devours everything. The Bible as literature, not just scripture. German folk tales collected from servants and street vendors. At 16, he falls in love for the first time. Gretchen, a girl from a lower social class, someone he meets through friends in situations his father would never approve. The relationship is mostly fantasy, stolen glances, a few conversations, but it consumes him. He writes poems, terrible adolescent verses full of longing and melodrama. Then scandal hits. Gretchen is involved in some kind of fraud or forgery. The details remain murky. The relationship ends abruptly, and Wolfgang is left with his first taste of how desire and reality collide, how social structures crush spontaneous feeling. In October 1765, Wolfgang leaves Frankfurt for Leipzig to study law. His father's plan, his father's dream, projected onto his son. Leipzig calls itself Little Paris, the most sophisticated city in Saxony, home to a university that attracts the sons of nobles and wealthy merchants. Wolfgang arrives as a provincial, dressed in Frankfurt fashion that Leipzig immediately marks as hopelessly outdated. The humiliation of those first weeks shapes him. His clothes are wrong. His manners are too stiff, too formal. Even his handwriting, that careful script his father insisted upon, is mocked as old-fashioned. Wolfgang could retreat, could cling to his provincial identity. Instead, he transforms himself. He buys new clothes, adopts Leipzig mannerisms, learns to move through these sophisticated circles. It's a performance, but he's always been good at those. The law lectures bore him to tears. Dry recitations of legal principles, memorization of procedures and precedents. His father expects regular reports on his studies, and Wolfgang writes dutiful letters while secretly spending his time elsewhere. He attends drawing lessons with Adam User, a respected artist who teaches him to really see, to understand composition and form. He goes to the theatre constantly, watching how professional actors inhabit their roles, and he falls in love again. Käthchen Schönkopf, daughter of a wine merchant, pretty and flirtatious, and utterly conventional. She's his first real relationship, not just fantasy from a distance. They meet at social gatherings, walk together in Leipzig's gardens, and Wolfgang pours his heart into poems for her. She seems to enjoy the attention but never takes him quite seriously. Years later, he'll recognise that she was right not to. He was performing love, writing poems about being in love, more interested in his own feelings than in her as a person. His health collapses in July 1768. The symptoms are severe: chest pain, difficulty breathing, coughing blood. The doctors diagnose it vaguely, treat it ineffectively. Wolfgang is bedridden for weeks, genuinely frightened he might die. He's 19 years old, and mortality suddenly feels real, not abstract. During this illness, something stranger happens. He befriends a woman named Susanna von Klettenberg, a pietist with mystical leanings. She introduces him to alchemy, to Paracelsus and Basilius Valentinus, to the idea that nature contains hidden correspondences, that the material and spiritual worlds mirror each other in secret patterns. Wolfgang, feverish and desperate, becomes obsessed. He sets up a small laboratory in his attic room, mixing chemicals, following obscure recipes, convinced he's on the verge of profound discoveries. He's not doing science, not really. He's doing something between chemistry and magic, treating substances as if they contain spiritual essences, looking for the philosopher's stone that will reveal the unity behind all creation. It's absurd medieval thinking in the Age of Enlightenment, and yet this period leaves a permanent mark. The conviction that nature operates according to hidden laws, that careful observation can reveal deep patterns, that the visible world is a language to be decoded. These ideas will never leave him. By August 1768, he's recovered enough to travel home to Frankfurt. He arrives thin, weakened, unsure of everything. His law studies are incomplete. His relationship with Kietchen has fizzled into nothing. He spent 2.5 years in Leipzig and has little to show for it except some mediocre poems and a head full of alchemical nonsense. His father is disappointed but pragmatic. Wolfgang needs to recover his health fully, and then they'll decide on next steps. The next 18 months unfold in Frankfurt, a strange suspended period. Wolfgang is technically convalescing, but he's also hiding, avoiding decisions, filling his time with reading and experiments, and long conversations with Susanna von Klettenberg when she visits. He reads voraciously, chaotically, Spinoza's philosophy, which suggests God and nature are one, that divinity saturates everything. This feels true to him in a way church doctrine never did. He reads Swedenborg's mystical visions of the spiritual world. He returns to the Greek tragedians, to Sophocles and Euripides, and begins to understand how drama can contain entire philosophies of existence. His sister Cornelia marries in 1770, and Wolfgang watches his closest companion disappear into conventional marriage with a man she doesn't love. It's an arranged match, socially appropriate, personally devastating. She'll die young, broken by childbirth and unhappiness, and Wolfgang will carry guilt about this for the rest of his life. He sees the trap closing, sees how society crushes individual will, especially for women, and he's powerless to stop it. By early 1770, his father insists it's time to finish his degree. Not Leipzig this time, but Strasbourg, a city on the French border, technically part of France but German-speaking, home to a university with a less rigorous law faculty. Wolfgang departs in April, and this journey will change everything. Not because of the law, which he'll continue to ignore, but because of who he's about to meet. Strasbourg sits on the Rhine, dominated by its Gothic cathedral, that massive red sandstone structure with its single completed spire reaching toward heaven. Wolfgang arrives, and immediately feels different here than he did in Leipzig. This city doesn't demand he perform sophistication. It's rougher, more vital, less concerned with French-Polish. He rents rooms, enrolls in law classes he'll barely attend, and begins exploring. The cathedral obsesses him. He climbs it repeatedly, ascending the narrow spiral stairs to the platform below the spire, looking out over the city and the river and the Black Forest beyond. Gothic architecture was considered barbaric in this era, crude medieval work compared to classical proportions. But Wolfgang stares at this building and sees something else entirely. He sees organic growth, stone transformed into something living, reaching upward, not through mathematical proportion, but through intuitive rightness, a German achievement, not an imitation of Roman or Greek models. In a tavern one evening, he meets Johann Gottfried Herder. This encounter will detonate everything Wolfgang thinks he knows about literature, culture, and his own potential. Herder is 5 years older, already a published critic and philosopher, travelling through Strasbourg for medical treatment. He's difficult, prickly, brilliant, contemptuous of convention, and he takes one look at the poems Wolfgang has been proudly writing and tears them to pieces. Herder doesn't ease Wolfgang into his worldview. He assaults him with it. Those poems Wolfgang brought, the ones carefully crafted according to Leipzig standards, all neat rhymes and classical allusions, derivative garbage, lifeless imitations of French imitations of ancient models. Wolfgang is writing corpse poetry, Herder tells him. Beautiful corpses, perhaps, but dead nonetheless. Real poetry doesn't come from rules. It comes from the folk, from the people, from the raw energy of language before academics strangled it. Look at Shakespeare, Herder insists. The English don't worship him despite his violations of classical unity. They worship him because he violated those rules, because he followed nature and human truth instead of Aristotelian prescriptions. Wolfgang is stunned. He's also electrified. Herder is articulating something Wolfgang has sensed but couldn't name. This feeling that all his careful education has been teaching him to write like a well-trained parrot. Herder gives him permission to trust his instincts, to value German culture instead of apologizing for it, to see poetry as something alive and wild rather than a display of technical skill. They meet almost daily during Herder's stay. Herder is recovering from an eye operation, often in pain, frequently irritable, but he keeps talking. He introduces Wolfgang to Ossian, those supposedly ancient Scottish epics that are actually contemporary forgeries by James Macpherson. But whether they're authentic or not doesn't matter to Herder. They feel ancient, they capture something primal, and that's what matters. Feeling, authenticity, the voice of the people. And he introduces Wolfgang to folk songs. Not the refined art songs of the salon, but the rough ballads peasants actually sing. Songs about murder and betrayal and supernatural revenge. Songs with irregular meters and strange leaps of logic and an emotional directness that makes salon poetry look like perfumed posturing. Wolfgang starts collecting these songs himself. He writes down lyrics from village singers, from soldiers, from anyone who knows the old ballads. He begins to hear German language differently, not as crude compared to French, but as powerful, direct, capable of effects French-Polish could never achieve. Herder leaves Strasbourg after a few months, but the damage is done. Wolfgang's entire aesthetic foundation has been demolished and rebuilt. He starts reading everything Herder recommended. Homer, but reading him as barbaric epic rather than classical model. The Nibelungenlied, that medieval German saga he'd been taught to dismiss as primitive, and Shakespeare, play after play, devouring them. The Shakespeare revelation hits hardest. Here's a writer who puts kings and clowns in the same scene, who mixes tragedy and comedy, who violates every rule Wolfgang learned and produces something more true to human experience than all the proper French tragedies combined. Julius Caesar, Hamlet, King Lear. Wolfgang reads them and feels his own ambition clarifying. He could write like this: not imitate Shakespeare, but do for German literature what Shakespeare did for English. Create a national drama that doesn't apologize for being German, but he's still supposed to be studying law. The dissertation he eventually submits argues that the church and state should both have authority over religious matters. The theology faculty rejects it as heretical. Wolfgang is unfazed. He quickly produces a shorter thesis on different legal questions, defends it in a cursory examination, and walks away with his law degree in August 1771. His father is satisfied. Wolfgang is now Dr. Goethe, qualified to practice law, ready to join a respectable society. Wolfgang has absolutely no intention of practicing law, but he returns to Frankfurt, moves back into his childhood home, and agrees to open a practice. He needs income. His father's patience has limits, so he becomes a lawyer technically, taking cases, appearing in court, doing the minimum necessary to maintain appearances, but every spare moment goes to writing. The first major project is his History of Gottfried von Berlichingen with the Iron Hand. Götz von Berlichingen was a real 16th century knight, a minor nobleman who lost his right hand in battle and had a mechanical iron replacement made. He fought, feuded, was declared an outlaw, wrote his memoirs. A perfect figure for what Wolfgang is trying to do. A German hero, rough and violent and free, operating in that moment when the medieval world was collapsing and the modern bureaucratic state was rising. Wolfgang writes the play in 6 weeks, during late 1771. It pours out of him. The structure is Shakespeare, dozens of short scenes, mixing high and low, nobles and peasants, battle and conversation. The language is German like Germans actually speak it, full of oaths and soldiers' slang and regional dialect. The hero is a man trying to remain free in a world increasingly controlled by princes and lawyers and bureaucrats. And he fails. The play ends with Goethe dying, the old order dead, freedom crushed by the machinery of the modern state. This play should not work according to every rule Wolfgang learned. It's structurally chaotic. It violates all 3 classical unities of time, place and action. The protagonist isn't noble, he's a bandit, and it's written in prose, not verse, which serious drama wasn't supposed to use. Wolfgang sends it to Herder. Herder's response is encouraging, but measured. It needs revision. Wolfgang doesn't care. He knows he's found his voice. For the first time in his life, he's written something that feels true, that sounds like him rather than like someone performing literature. He starts planning more plays. His head is full of projects. A drama about Faust, that legendary magician who sold his soul. Another about Caesar. He's writing poetry again too, but different poetry now. Shorter lyrics that sound like folk songs, that trust feeling over cleverness. And then, in May 1772, his father arranges for him to do a legal internship at the Imperial Chamber Court in Wetzlar. Wetzlar is a small city about 50 kilometers north of Frankfurt, home to the Reichskammergericht, one of the highest courts in the Holy Roman Empire. It's a bureaucratic nightmare, a court so backlogged with cases that some have been pending for over a century. Lawyers and clerks swarm around it like flies, filing motions, writing briefs, accomplishing almost nothing. Wolfgang arrives and is immediately bored. The work is tedious beyond description. He attends court sessions, takes notes, helps prepare documents, and watches justice move at geological speed. He shares lodgings with a young lawyer named Kästner, a solid, sensible man engaged to a young woman named Charlotte Buff. She's 19, the daughter of a local official, managing her father's household and raising her younger siblings after her mother's death. Wolfgang meets her at a dance in the village of Wolpertshausen in June. She's wearing a simple white dress with pink ribbons. She's surrounded by children because she brought several of her siblings to the dance. She's cheerful, capable, completely unpretentious. Wolfgang falls catastrophically in love, not the Leipzig infatuation. This is different, more total, more desperate. Lotte is everything Wolfgang wants and can never have. She's engaged to Kästner, a good man, a friend. She's kind to Wolfgang, but clear about her commitment. And Wolfgang doesn't care. He can't care. He inserts himself into their lives, visiting daily, accompanying them on walks, reading to them, playing with the children, torturing himself. Kästner tolerates this with remarkable patience. He recognizes that Wolfgang is harmless, that Lotte isn't encouraging him, that this is some kind of artistic temperament expressing itself. Lotte handles Wolfgang with gentle firmness, making clear the boundaries while remaining friendly. They become a strange trio, spending nearly every day together through the summer of 1772. Wolfgang writes to his friends that he's found paradise. He describes scenes of domestic bliss, simple meals, evening walks, reading Homer aloud while Lotte sews. He's constructing a fantasy where this could be his life, where he belongs to this peaceful household instead of his father's demanding one in Frankfurt. But it's torture disguised as paradise. Every moment with Lotte reminds him she's not his. Every kindness she shows him is also a boundary being maintained. He writes feverish letters describing his condition. He knows it's impossible. He knows he should leave. He stays. The work at the court continues to be meaningless. Wolfgang meets another young lawyer there, Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem, a sensitive, melancholic man who's even more miserable in Wetzlar than Wolfgang is. Jerusalem has also fallen in love with an engaged woman, the wife of a colleague. Unlike Wolfgang, he's being shunned for it, excluded from society, driven into isolation. They talk occasionally, two unhappy young men trapped in a suffocating town. By September, Wolfgang knows he has to leave. The situation with Lotte is becoming unbearable. He's accomplishing nothing at the court. His father expects him to return and establish his law practice properly. On September 11th, without warning, he departs. Just leaves. Writes a brief note to Lotte and Kästner saying he can't say goodbye in person and flees back to Frankfurt. The leaving solves nothing. He's back in his father's house, supposedly working as a lawyer, actually just miserable. He writes constantly to Kästner and Lotte, long letters describing his state of mind, asking about their lives, unable to let go. Kästner responds patiently. Lotte writes occasionally, warm but careful. They get married in April 1773. Wolfgang receives the news like a death sentence he'd known was coming. And then in late October 1772, Wolfgang receives shocking news from Wetzlar. Jerusalem is dead. Suicide. He borrowed pistols from Kästner, claiming he needed them for a journey. Then he shot himself in his apartment, alone, after months of increasing desperation over his impossible love and his social isolation. He died slowly, lingering through the night before expiring the next afternoon. Wolfgang is shattered. That could have been him. Should have been him, perhaps, if he were more consistent, more committed to his despair. Jerusalem did what Wolfgang only fantasized about. He followed impossible love to its logical conclusion. The story obsesses him. He writes to Kästner demanding every detail. What was Jerusalem wearing when they found him? What books were open in his room? How exactly did it happen? Kästner sends a detailed account. Jerusalem was found at his desk, Lessing's play Emilia Galotti open before him, having shot himself in the head above the right eye. He'd been wearing his blue coat and yellow vest. The clothes matter to Wolfgang. The specificity matters. He begins writing in January 1774. Not a play this time, a novel. The story pours out of him in 4 weeks of manic composition. He merges his own experience with Lotte and Jerusalem's suicide into a single narrative. The protagonist is Werther, a young artist who arrives in a small town and falls in love with Lotte, who's engaged to Albert. The setting is thinly disguised Wetzlar. The characters are thinly disguised versions of Wolfgang, Charlotte Buff, and Kästner. But Werther doesn't leave like Wolfgang did. He stays, he suffers. And eventually, in December, he borrows pistols from Albert and shoots himself. The novel is written as a series of letters Werther sends to a friend, documenting his emotional disintegration in real time. The final section shifts to a narrator describing Werther's death, based directly on the details Wolfgang extracted from Kästner about Jerusalem's suicide. Wolfgang calls it The Sorrows of Young Werther. He writes it in a white heat, living inside Werther's consciousness, pushing himself into that mental space where suicide seems like the only authentic response to impossible circumstances. It's dangerous. He'll later say that writing the book saved him from actually following Werther's path, that he needed to live through it on paper to purge it from his system. He finishes in late February. The manuscript is explosive, and he knows it. This isn't a proper novel according to 18th century standards. There's no moral lesson. The protagonist isn't punished for his excessive sensibility. He's presented sympathetically, his feelings validated even as they destroy him. And he commits suicide, which was considered a sin, a crime, utterly taboo. Wolfgang finds a publisher quickly. The book appears in September 1774, published anonymously at first, though everyone immediately knows who wrote it. The reaction is instantaneous and volcanic. The book detonates across German-speaking Europe like nothing anyone has seen before. Within weeks, young men are dressing like Werther. Blue coat, yellow vest, brown boots. It becomes a uniform of sensibility, a costume that announces you feel things deeply, that you understand what the masses cannot. Bookshops can't keep copies on shelves. Pirated editions flood the market. Translations appear in French, English, Italian. By the end of the decade, Werther has been translated into every major European language and several minor ones. But something darker happens alongside the fame. Young men start killing themselves. They leave copies of Werther open beside their bodies. Some dress in the blue coat and yellow vest before pulling the trigger. The authorities panic. Leipzig bans the book. Copenhagen bans it. Several Italian cities ban it. The church condemns it as an incitement to sin. Parents burn copies they find in their sons' rooms. Wolfgang watches all this with complicated feelings. He's famous now, genuinely famous, but the fame is attached to a character who kills himself out of romantic despair. People treat him like he's Werther, like he's about to shoot himself at any moment. Young men write him letters describing their own impossible loves, asking if they should follow Werther's example. He has to tell them repeatedly that the point was to survive by writing it, not to actually do it. The novel's success creates a trap. Every publisher wants another Werther. Every reader wants more of that emotional intensity, that validation of excessive feeling. But Wolfgang knows he can't repeat it. Writing Werther purged something from his system. He's not that person anymore, or he's trying not to be. He's also dealing with the aftermath in Wetzlar. Kästner is furious. He and Lotte recognize themselves immediately in the novel, and the portrayal is intimate enough to be embarrassing. Their private lives have been turned into public entertainment. Kästner writes Wolfgang an angry letter. How could you do this? You've made us into characters, into symbols. People in Wetzlar are gossiping. Lotte is humiliated. Wolfgang responds with a mix of defensiveness and apology. He insists he changed enough details that no one should recognize them. This is absurd, and Kästner tells him so. Everyone recognizes them. The book describes their actual house, their actual habits, actual conversations. Wolfgang has taken their lives and repurposed them as raw material for his art, and he's done it without permission. The friendship never fully recovers. Years later, Wolfgang will minimize the real people behind the fiction, will claim Werther was purely imagination. But the letters between him and Kästner from this period tell a different story. Wolfgang knows exactly what he's done. He's turned life into literature, and he's discovered that this transformation has consequences. Meanwhile, he's stuck in Frankfurt, still working at his father's insistence on legal cases he finds mind-numbing. The success of Werther makes this life even more intolerable. He's a famous author doing contract law in a provincial city. His father doesn't care. Literary fame means nothing to Johann Caspar. It doesn't produce steady income or social respectability. Wolfgang needs to focus on his career. But the Werther fame brings opportunities. In November 1774, Wolfgang receives an invitation that will change everything. Karl August, the young Duke of Saxe-Weimar, is 18 years old and about to assume full control of his duchy. He's read Werther, he's obsessed with it, and he wants to meet the author. The meeting happens in Frankfurt. Karl August is travelling with his close friend and advisor, Karl Ludwig von Knebel. They show up at the Goethe house, and Wolfgang is introduced to a teenage duke who treats him like a celebrity. Karl August is everything Wolfgang isn't. Born to power, secure in his position, able to do whatever he wants. But he's also young, enthusiastic, desperate for culture and excitement in his small duchy. They hit it off immediately. Wolfgang is charming, brilliant in conversation, exactly as advertised. Karl August is generous, open, genuinely interested in literature and ideas. They spend hours talking. Before the Duke leaves Frankfurt, he makes Wolfgang a remarkable offer. Come to Weimar, be part of the court. We'll find you a position. You can write, you can be part of something bigger than legal documents in Frankfurt. Wolfgang is tempted but cautious. Court life has its own traps. He'd be dependent on ducal favour, subject to the whims of an 18-year-old ruler. And Weimar is tiny, barely 10,000 people, a minor duchy in the complex patchwork of German states. It's not a glittering capital, it's a provincial town with aristocratic pretensions. But what's the alternative? Staying in Frankfurt, becoming the lawyer his father wants, watching his literary fame fade into respectability? The Werther success has shown him what's possible. People across Europe are reading his words, feeling what he made them feel. How can he go back to property disputes after that? In May 1775, Wolfgang makes a decision that horrifies his father. He accepts an invitation to travel with the Stolberg brothers, two young counts who are admirers of Werther. They're going to Switzerland, and they want the famous author to join them. Johann Caspar sees this for what it is, his son abandoning any pretense of a legal career to wander around Europe with aristocratic dilettantes. The Swiss trip is glorious. Wolfgang is treated as a celebrity everywhere they go. People want to meet the author of Werther, want to hear him talk, want to be in the presence of genius. He hikes in the mountains, writes poetry, falls half in love with several young women, and generally lives the life of a romantic artist that his novel has made fashionable. But by the time he returns to Frankfurt in July, the gap between his life and his father's expectations has become unbridgeable. Johann Caspar wants stability. Wolfgang wants transformation. The tension in the house is unbearable. Then in November 1775, another letter arrives from Karl August. The young Duke is now fully in power in Weimar. The invitation is renewed, this time more formally. Come to Weimar. Not as a visitor, but as a permanent member of the court. We'll give you a position, a salary, a place to work and write. Wolfgang accepts. His father is devastated. All those years of education, the legal training, the careful preparation for a respectable career, and his son is throwing it away to become a courtier in a backwater duchy. They argue. Johann Caspar predicts disaster. Wolfgang is making a terrible mistake, sacrificing security for the fantasy of literary life. But Wolfgang leaves anyway. On November 7th, 1775, he arrives in Weimar. He's 26 years old. He thinks he'll stay a few months, maybe a year. He'll end up staying 57 years, until his death. Weimar in 1775 is not impressive by any objective standard. The ducal residence is modest. The town is small, provincial, culturally insignificant, but it has two things going for it. First, the young Duke is genuinely committed to making Weimar a centre of culture and learning. And second, Wolfgang has just arrived. Karl August makes him a privy councillor almost immediately, a position that comes with real political responsibility. Wolfgang isn't just decorating the court, he's expected to work to help govern. Within months, he's being assigned actual administrative tasks, overseeing mining operations, managing the duchy's finances, handling diplomatic correspondence. This is not what anyone expected. The sensitive author of Werther, the poet of impossible love and beautiful despair, is suddenly managing budgets and inspecting mines. Wolfgang throws himself into it with characteristic intensity. If he's going to do this, he'll do it completely. He learns how mines work. He studies forestry. He sits through interminable meetings about tax policy. His literary friends are baffled. What happened to the artist? Why is he wasting his time on administrative minutiae when he could be writing? Wolfgang doesn't have a good answer, or rather, he has too many answers. He's proving something to himself maybe, proving he can function in the real world, that he's not just the fragile artistic soul of his novel, or he's fleeing from the expectations that Werther created, from the demand that he keep producing that level of emotional intensity. Or maybe he's just discovered that he likes power. Being close to someone who can actually make things happen, who can change laws and build institutions, that's intoxicating in a different way than writing is. Literature affects people's feelings. Governance affects their actual lives. But there's another factor, and her name is Charlotte von Stein. She's married, 7 years older than Wolfgang, a lady-in-waiting at the Weimar court. She's intelligent, cultured, emotionally reserved in a way that fascinates him. He meets her shortly after arriving, and within weeks he's obsessed. This is Lotte Buff all over again, except this time, he's not leaving. He's staying right here, seeing her constantly at court functions, writing her letters, turning her into his muse and confidante, and the centre of his emotional universe. Charlotte von Stein is not particularly beautiful, not obviously charismatic. What she has is self-possession, a kind of emotional discipline that Wolfgang lacks completely. He writes her hundreds of letters over the next decade. Some days, multiple letters. He needs her approval, her guidance, her presence. She becomes the person he writes to about everything: his work, his reading, his thoughts, his feelings. And she responds, but carefully, always maintaining a distance, never giving him quite enough to satisfy the hunger. It's Werther without the suicide. The same pattern of impossible love, the same elevation of a woman into an ideal, the same emotional dependency. Except this time Wolfgang is channeling it into something else. Instead of a novel, he's building a life. Instead of self-destruction, he's choosing self-control, or Charlotte's control, which amounts to the same thing. She becomes his education in restraint. Under her influence, he starts writing differently. Less emotional outpouring, more classical form. He studies Greek and Latin more seriously. He's trying to master himself, to become the kind of person she might respect, even if she'll never love him the way he wants. The early Weimar years are strange. Wolfgang is famous across Europe as the author of Werther, but in Weimar he's primarily known as the Duke's friend and an increasingly important government official. He's writing, but privately, not publishing much. He starts projects and abandons them. He's in transition, though toward what, he doesn't yet know. Carl August treats him less like an employee and more like a brother. They go hunting together, they drink together, they discuss politics and philosophy and women. The Duke is giving Wolfgang something he's never had: unconditional acceptance from someone with real power. Not a father's conditional approval, dependent on career choices, but genuine friendship. In 1776, Wolfgang is given more responsibilities. He joins the Privy Council officially. He's involved in military matters now, in addition to mining and forestry. For someone who wrote the most famous anti-establishment novel of the decade, he's becoming remarkably establishment. The ironies are not lost on him, but he keeps working. His father dies in 1782. The relationship never recovered from Wolfgang's decision to abandon law for Weimar. Johann Caspar went to his grave convinced his son had wasted his potential, had chosen flash over substance, celebrity over respectability. Wolfgang inherits money and property, but more importantly, he's finally free from that paternal judgment, that constant disappointment. By the mid-1780s, Wolfgang has been in Weimar for a decade. He's in his mid-30s. He's a successful administrator, a valued counsellor to the Duke, a respected figure in the small world of Weimar. He's still writing to Charlotte von Stein daily, still emotionally dependent on her measured responses. But something's wrong. He can feel it. He's successful by every external measure, except the one that brought him to Weimar in the first place. He's barely writing. The few things he's working on feel forced, incomplete. He's becoming what he feared most: respectable, established, domesticated. The restlessness builds slowly. He starts reading about Italy, obsessively, looking at prints of Roman ruins, studying Italian architecture and art. Italy represents something he desperately needs: escape, transformation, the possibility of becoming someone else entirely. In September 1786, without telling anyone except his servant, Wolfgang makes a decision that will shock everyone who knows him. He boards a carriage at 3 in the morning on September 3rd, telling no one where he's going. Not Charlotte von Stein, not the Duke, not his colleagues on the Privy Council. Just gone. He leaves a brief note saying he needs a rest, that he'll return soon. It's a lie. He has no intention of returning soon, and he knows the explosion this will cause. The journey south is a revelation. As the carriage crosses the Alps, Wolfgang feels something lifting. The weight of Weimar, of duty, of Charlotte's careful letters, and the Duke's expectations, all of it falls away with every mile. He's travelling under a false name, calling himself Filippo Miller, painter. He wants to be nobody, to see Italy without the burden of being Goethe. Italy in 1786 is the destination every educated European dreams of. The Grand Tour, that pilgrimage to classical civilization, has been a rite of passage for wealthy young men for decades. But Wolfgang is 37, hardly young, and he's not wealthy. He's spending money he doesn't really have, abandoning responsibilities he absolutely has, running away like a teenager. He doesn't care. Verona first, then Venice. The light is different here, sharper, clearer. Colours seem more vivid. The architecture speaks a language he's been trying to learn from books and prints, but seeing it in person is entirely different. He sketches constantly. His drawing is mediocre at best, but that doesn't matter. He's trying to see, really see, to train his eye to understand proportion and form and beauty in a way he never has before. In Rome, he stays for months. He rents rooms, establishes routines. Every morning he walks through the city, looking at ruins, churches, fountains. He's studying, but not from books. From the physical presence of ancient civilization, from the way light falls on marble, from the proportions of buildings that have stood for 2,000 years. He meets other German artists living in Rome. Johann Heinrich Wilhelm Tischbein becomes a close friend, a painter who actually knows what he's doing. Tischbein will later paint the iconic portrait of Goethe in the Campagna, Wolfgang reclining in a white cloak among Roman ruins, looking every inch the romantic poet-traveller. But right now, Wolfgang is just another German tourist trying to understand why Rome matters so much. What he's discovering is classicism, not the stiff, dead classicism of academic rules, but something alive. The Greeks and Romans understood something about form, about restraint, about the relationship between parts and whole that later ages lost. Beauty isn't wild emotion, it's proportion, it's balance, it's knowing when to stop. This is the opposite of everything Werther represented. Werther was pure feeling, uncontrolled, self-destructive. Rome is teaching Wolfgang that feeling needs form, that emotion without structure is just chaos. He's having an aesthetic conversion, and it will change everything he writes afterward. Back in Weimar, people are furious. Charlotte von Stein feels betrayed. 10 years of letters, of emotional intimacy, and he just vanished without a real explanation. The Duke is trying to manage government business without his most trusted advisor. The court gossips about Wolfgang's irresponsibility, his selfishness. Some think he's lost his mind. Others assume he's run off with some woman. Wolfgang knows all of this is happening, and he doesn't come back. He extends his stay. 1 month becomes 3, then 6. He moves south to Naples, sees Pompeii and Herculaneum, those cities frozen in volcanic ash, Roman life preserved in death. He crosses to Sicily. He's gone for nearly 2 years. During these Italian years, he's writing, but differently. He finishes Iphigenie of Tauris, a play he'd started in Weimar. The Weimar version was in prose, emotional, Germanic. The Italian version is in verse, classical, restrained. It's the same story, but transformed. Iphigenia, who in Greek tragedy is saved by the goddess and becomes a priestess, uses reason and honesty rather than trickery to escape. It's tragedy without the tragedy, conflict resolved through understanding rather than blood. This is Wolfgang's new aesthetic in action. He's also working on Torquato Tasso, a play about a Renaissance poet who goes mad at the court of Ferrara. The parallels to Wolfgang's own situation are obvious. Tasso is an artist trying to function in a courtly world, pulled between creative freedom and social duty, between genius and madness. But unlike Werther, Tasso doesn't end in suicide. It ends in painful self-awareness. Tasso recognizes his own delusions, accepts his limitations. It's a more mature working through of the same problem. In June 1788, Wolfgang finally returns to Weimar. He's been gone 22 months. The city he returns to hasn't changed, but he has, completely. He looks different, leaner, more tanned. He dresses differently, favouring Italian styles. But the real change is internal. The restless, conflicted administrator who left is now someone who knows what he believes about art, about beauty, about how to live. Charlotte von Stein will barely speak to him. Their long relationship is essentially over. She feels abandoned, and no amount of explanation will repair it. Wolfgang tries, writes to her, but the intimacy is gone. That decade-long chapter of his life has closed. He brings something else back from Italy. In Rome, he met a young woman named Christiane Vulpius. Actually, he met her after returning to Weimar. She works in a flower factory, making artificial flowers. She's 23. He's 40. She's working class, uneducated. The exact opposite of everything his social position should desire. He falls in love with her immediately, or something like love. Physical attraction, certainly, something he never had with Charlotte von Stein. He moves Christiane into his house. They're not married. This is scandalous. Weimar society is appalled. The famous poet, the privy councillor, living openly with a factory girl? It's unthinkable. His friends are embarrassed. Charlotte von Stein is vindicated in her anger. The Duke, to his credit, doesn't interfere. Their friendship survives this. Wolfgang doesn't care what Weimar thinks. He's done with restraint for restraint's sake, done with letting other people's expectations dictate his life. Christiane makes him happy in an uncomplicated way. She's not an ideal, not a muse, not a philosophical companion. She's a real woman he enjoys being with. They have a son in 1789, August. Wolfgang is a father now, though still not a husband. The French Revolution begins in 1789. News travels slowly, but when it arrives, it divides Weimar as it divides all of Europe. Some intellectuals are thrilled. Finally, the old tyrannies are being overthrown. Liberty, equality, fraternity. The world is being remade according to reason and natural rights. Others are horrified. Mob rule, chaos, the destruction of order and tradition. Wolfgang watches from a distance, disturbed by the violence but also by the revolutionary enthusiasm of people he knows. He's spent the last decade as a government official. He understands how difficult it is to actually administer a state, to balance competing interests, to make imperfect choices in complicated situations. The revolutionary faith that everything can be torn down and rebuilt according to rational principles strikes him as dangerously naive. He's seen what happens when pure feeling drives action. Werther was an individual tragedy. The revolution might be a collective one. In 1792, Karl August joins the Prussian military campaign against revolutionary France. Wolfgang goes with him, not as a soldier, but as an observer. He's at the Battle of Valmy, where the Prussian forces, expected to easily crush the revolutionary French army, are instead held to a stalemate. It's a turning point. The old military order can't simply roll over the new revolutionary one. Wolfgang recognizes the significance immediately. He later claims he told people at the time, "From this place and from this day forth begins a new era in world history. And you can all say you were present at its birth." Whether he actually said that or invented it later doesn't really matter. The insight is correct. Valmy proves that the revolution can defend itself, that the old world can't simply restore itself by force. The next 2 decades will be defined by this conflict, and Wolfgang will watch it unfold from Weimar, increasingly convinced that both sides are wrong. The revolutionaries with their abstract ideals and their guillotines, the monarchists with their rigid hierarchies and their refusal to acknowledge that change is necessary. He's looking for a third position, something between reaction and revolution, but he can't quite articulate what that would be. His writing continues. In 1794, he begins a friendship that will define the rest of his productive life. Friedrich Schiller, 10 years younger, is also a famous writer. He wrote The Robbers, a revolutionary play about outlaws fighting tyranny, when he was in his early 20s. He's been living in Jena, teaching history at the university, writing philosophical essays on aesthetics. Wolfgang has known of him for years but kept his distance. Schiller's early work struck him as too wild, too undisciplined, too much like his own Werther phase. But Schiller has matured too. He's interested in classical form now, in philosophy, in understanding the relationship between art and ethics. When they finally start corresponding regularly, something clicks. They're approaching the same problems from different angles. Schiller is more philosophical, more systematic. Wolfgang is more intuitive, more focused on concrete observation. Together, they push each other. Schiller moves to Weimar in 1799. For the next 6 years, until his death in 1805, he and Wolfgang are in constant contact. They read each other's work, critique it, encourage it. Schiller convinces Wolfgang to return to Faust, that fragmentary drama he'd started decades earlier and abandoned. Under Schiller's encouragement, Wolfgang begins working on it seriously again, expanding it, deepening it. It will take him the rest of his life to finish. They also collaborate on lighter projects. Xenion, a collection of satirical epigrams mocking their literary rivals, bad critics, philosophical pretensions. Some of it is genuinely funny. Most of it is probably too insider for anyone outside their immediate circle to appreciate, but the collaboration energizes both of them. Wolfgang is also running the Weimar Court Theatre now, appointed director in 1791. He's staging plays, training actors, dealing with the constant drama of theatrical life. It's administrative work again, but this time in service of art rather than mining rights. He's developing theories about how actors should move, how they should speak. Classical and controlled, not naturalistic. Everything measured, nothing excessive. His actors sometimes find him tyrannical, obsessed with details of gesture and pronunciation that seem arbitrary. But the Weimar theatre under his direction becomes known across Germany for its quality. Schiller writes his great plays during these Weimar years. Wallenstein, a massive trilogy about the 30 Years' War. Mary Stuart, about Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots. The Maid of Orleans, about Joan of Arc. Wilhelm Tell, about Swiss independence. These are historical dramas, but they're really about political and moral philosophy. What is freedom? What is duty? When is rebellion justified? When is compromise necessary? Schiller is working through the same questions raised by the French Revolution, but in dramatic form, with enough historical distance to avoid immediate partisan fury. Wolfgang watches these plays in rehearsal, offers suggestions, argues with Schiller about interpretation and staging. It's the most intellectually alive he's been since his early Weimar years, maybe since Strasbourg with Herder. Having an equal to argue with, someone whose judgment he respects, transforms his own work. In 1805, Schiller dies. He's only 45. Tuberculosis, probably, though the diagnosis isn't certain. Wolfgang is devastated in a way he hasn't been since his sister's death. Schiller was the last great friendship of his life, and now it's gone. The Weimar years continue, but something vital has left them. Wolfgang is 60 when Schiller dies, and the loss changes something fundamental. There's no one left who can challenge him intellectually as an equal. No one whose judgment matters quite the same way. The younger generation in Weimar respects him, reveres him even, but reverence is not the same as friendship. He becomes more isolated, more absorbed in his own projects. The world outside Weimar is transforming at a pace he finds increasingly difficult to track. Napoleon Bonaparte is reshaping Europe through military conquest. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient phantom that has lingered for 1,000 years, is formally dissolved in 1806. The old order Wolfgang knew as a child, the patchwork of principalities and free cities and prince-bishoprics, is being swept away. Napoleon's armies march through Germany. In October 1806, French troops occupy Weimar after the Battle of Jena. Wolfgang's house is nearly ransacked by soldiers. Only the intervention of a French officer who recognizes his name saves his library and collections. It's a close call, and it rattles him. The French occupation brings chaos, soldiers billeted in homes, requisitions of food and supplies, the constant threat of violence. Wolfgang retreats further into work. If the political world is insane, at least art and science offer some stability. He publishes his Theory of Colours in 1810, the scientific work he considers his greatest achievement. It's a massive book, hundreds of pages attacking Newton's optics and proposing an alternative understanding of colour based on subjective experience rather than mathematical physics. Wolfgang is convinced he's right, and that Newton is fundamentally wrong about the nature of light. He's not. Newton's mathematics are correct, and Wolfgang's theory, while containing interesting observations about colour perception, is scientifically incorrect. But he never accepts this. He believes to the end of his life that his colour theory is more important than all his poetry. It's a strange blind spot in an otherwise brilliant mind. His poetry and prose from these later years show a writer still experimenting, still refusing to settle into a fixed style. The Elective Affinities, published in 1809, is a novel about marriage, attraction, and the conflict between duty and desire. The title comes from chemistry, the way certain elements bond with some substances and not others. Wolfgang applies this metaphor to human relationships. 4 people, 2 married couples, rearrange themselves according to deeper affinities that override social convention. The novel is cool, almost scientific in its observation of emotional dynamics. There's tragedy, but it's presented with a detachment that some readers find disturbing. Is he endorsing adultery? Critiquing it? The novel refuses to moralize clearly, and that ambiguity makes it fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. He's also writing poetry again, but in a new mode. The West Eastern Divan, published in sections between 1819 and 1827, is inspired by Persian poetry. Wolfgang has been reading translations of Hafiz, the 14th century Persian poet, and he's captivated by the form, the imagery, the combination of sensuality and mysticism. He writes his own poems in dialogue with Hafiz, creating a fictional persona, a German poet engaging with an Eastern master across centuries and cultures. Some of the poems are love lyrics addressed to Marianne von Willemer, a woman 35 years younger than him with whom he had a brief but intense relationship. Others are philosophical, exploring the relationship between West and East, Christianity and Islam, reason and ecstasy. It's work unlike anything else in German literature at the time, cosmopolitan and strange, drawing on sources his contemporaries barely know. The younger Romantic writers, the generation that includes the Schlegel brothers and Novalis and Tieck, regard Wolfgang with a mixture of respect and frustration. He's the great predecessor, the author of Werther and the early lyrics they all grew up reading, but his classicism feels cold to them. They want passion, irrationality, the embrace of the infinite and the fragmentary. Wolfgang's insistence on form and measure seems like a refusal of what Romanticism is really about, and Wolfgang, for his part, finds them undisciplined. He respects some of their work, but he thinks they're too willing to indulge in formlessness, to celebrate chaos rather than shape it. He's becoming a living monument. Visitors come to Weimar specifically to meet him. Writers, scientists, aristocrats on the Grand Tour all want an audience with the great Goethe. He receives them politely, sometimes warmly, but there's a performance aspect to it now. He's aware that he's expected to be wise, to deliver pronouncements, to embody German culture. Sometimes he plays the role, sometimes he retreats into formality and leaves his guests disappointed. Christiane dies in 1816. They've been together for 28 years, married for the last 14. The Weimar court never fully accepted her, and Wolfgang's own writings about her are oddly restrained, as if he's protecting something private from public view, but her death affects him deeply. The house feels empty. He's 77, and the structure of his daily life, the domestic routines he's relied on, are gone. He fills the emptiness with work, always work. He's still revising Faust, that project that has haunted him for nearly 60 years. Part 1 was published in 1808, a version of the story he'd sketched in his 20s. The scholar who makes a pact with the devil, who seduces and destroys an innocent girl, who searches for knowledge and experience and finds only emptiness. But Wolfgang has been planning a part 2 for years. Something larger, stranger, more metaphysical. He works on it in fragments, adding scenes, revising, expanding. It becomes a kind of repository for everything he's thought about philosophy, politics, art, science. It's also increasingly difficult to understand. The plot is dreamlike, allegorical, full of references to classical mythology and contemporary politics and alchemical symbolism. Even Wolfgang seems uncertain what it all means, but he keeps working. His conversations with Johann Peter Eckermann, a young writer who becomes his assistant and secretary in 1823, are recorded and later published as Conversations with Goethe. Eckermann visits almost daily, asking questions, taking notes, preserving Wolfgang's thoughts on everything from poetry to politics to gardening. The conversations show a mind still sharp, still curious, but also increasingly aware of its own impending end. Wolfgang talks about his life, his work, his regrets. He's surprisingly candid sometimes. Other times he's performing again, shaping his legacy, deciding what the official version of his life should be. He's outlived almost everyone. Herder died in 1803, Wieland in 1813, Schiller in 1805. His mother died in 1808, his sister Cornelia decades earlier. Most of his early Weimar circle is gone. The Duke Karl August dies in 1828, ending a friendship that lasted over 50 years. Wolfgang is the last man standing, the survivor of a generation that feels increasingly remote from the world around him. The 1820s are the decade of his final celebrity. When he turns 80 in 1829, there are celebrations across Germany. Poems written in his honour, festivals, commemorative publications. He's no longer just a writer, but a symbol of German culture itself. The irony is that he's never been particularly nationalistic. He reads French, English, Italian literature with as much interest as German. He corresponds with writers across Europe. He thinks of himself as a European, not just a German. But Germany needs heroes, and he's been drafted into service. His last great passion is for Ulrike von Levetzow, a girl of 17 he meets in 1821, when he's 72. He sees her at a spa town, Marienbad, where he's taking the waters for his health. She's beautiful, lively, completely unattainable. He's old enough to be her grandfather. He knows this is absurd, and yet the feeling is real, overwhelming, painful. He even considers proposing marriage, asks the Duke to intervene on his behalf with her family. The answer is no, delivered gently but firmly. Of course it's no. In 1823, he writes the Marienbad Elegy, one of his greatest late poems, a meditation on age, desire, loss. The passion is undimmed by time, but the body is failing, and the world no longer accommodates such feelings in a man his age. The poem is heartbreaking precisely because it's so honest about the absurdity and the reality of the emotion. Faust Part 2 is finally completed in 1831. He seals the manuscript and leaves instructions that it should not be published until after his death. It's his final statement, the summation of a lifetime's thinking, and he doesn't want to deal with the reactions, the criticisms, the misunderstandings. Let it speak for itself after he's gone. The play is vast, cosmic in scope. Faust is redeemed in the end, not because he's earned it through virtue, but because he's never stopped striving, never stopped seeking. The final lines, sung by a chorus of angels, declare that eternal feminine draws us upward. It's mystical, almost religious, though what exactly Wolfgang means by it remains disputed. His health is declining. He's had heart trouble for years, shortness of breath, weakness, but his mind remains clear almost to the end. He continues his daily routines, his walks when weather permits, his work at his desk, his evenings with Eckermann discussing literature and science. On March 16th, 1832, he catches a chill. It develops into something more serious. Over the next few days, he weakens rapidly. He remains lucid, giving instructions about his papers, asking about the weather. On March 22nd, he dies quietly in his armchair. His last words, according to Eckermann, are, "Open the shutter, so more light may come in," though this may be apocryphal, shaped by the desire for a symbolically perfect ending. He's 82 years old. The funeral is elaborate. Weimar stops. The Duke declares a period of mourning. Wolfgang is buried in the ducal vault alongside Schiller, whose remains were moved there years earlier. The two friends reunited in death. Across Germany, memorial services are held. Poets write elegies, newspapers publish tributes. The recognition is universal. Something has ended, not just a life, but an era. And yet the work remains, and the work continues to generate new meanings. Within years of his death, Wolfgang's reputation begins to shift and multiply. The Romantics he'd been ambivalent about now claim him as a precursor. Nationalists use his writings to define German identity. Scientists cite his morphological studies. Composers set his poems to music. Schubert alone composed over 70 Goethe settings. Beethoven, Schumann, Brahms, Wolf, Mahler all drew on his texts. His influence spreads beyond Germany. In England, Carlyle writes essays championing him. In America, Emerson and Margaret Fuller study him closely. In Russia, Turgenev translates him. His vision of self-cultivation, of Bildung, the idea that life is a process of continuous development and education, becomes central to 19th century thought. The Bildungsroman, the novel of formation, descends directly from Wilhelm Meister. Faust becomes the defining myth of modernity, the scholar who makes a pact with the devil, who gains knowledge and power but loses his soul, or doesn't, depending on how you read the ending. It's staged constantly, adapted, reinterpreted. Composers create operas based on it. Philosophers analyze it. Psychologists use it as a case study. The figure of Faust, endlessly striving, never satisfied, becomes a symbol of Western civilization itself, for better and worse. But there's also resistance. Nietzsche admires Wolfgang's paganism, his affirmation of life, but finds him too measured, too Apollonian. Where is the Dionysian ecstasy? Thomas Mann writes novels in dialogue with Wolfgang's work, especially The Magic Mountain, which reworks the Bildungsroman for the 20th century. But Mann is also aware of Wolfgang's limitations, his occasional coldness, his refusal of political commitments. The Nazis try to claim him, holding up Faust as an embodiment of Germanic striving and destiny. This appropriation is grotesque, a willful misreading of a writer whose cosmopolitanism and humanism were the opposite of fascist ideology. After World War II, Wolfgang's reputation in Germany has to be reconstructed, separated from nationalist distortion. By the late 20th century, scholarly opinion fractures. Some see him as the last universal genius, a mind capable of contributing meaningfully to literature, science, philosophy, politics. Others see him as a privileged aristocrat whose detachment from social struggle was a moral failure. Feminist critics examine his treatment of women, both in life and in his writing. Post-colonial scholars question his Orientalism, the way he appropriates Eastern forms in the West-Eastern divan. Every generation finds new angles, new criticisms, new appreciations. What remains undisputed is the sheer scale of the achievement. 82 years of life, 60 years of sustained creative output across multiple genres. Novels, plays, poems, scientific treatises, autobiography, literary criticism, thousands of letters. The collected works run to over 100 volumes. No single reader can hold it all in mind at once, and yet the individual works continue to reward attention. Werther still captures the intensity of youthful despair. The Roman elegies still convey erotic joy with rare directness. Faust still asks the fundamental questions about knowledge, power, and redemption. The question that haunts every reader eventually is whether Wolfgang's vision of self-cultivation, his careful balance between passion and reason, has any relevance to our accelerated, fractured age. Can the ideal of Bildung survive the 21st century? Consider what's changed. Wolfgang lived in a world where a single educated person could plausibly engage with the full range of human knowledge. Science hadn't yet splintered into 1,000 specializations. Literature hadn't fragmented into competing movements and counter-movements. A poet could also be a statesman, a scientist, an administrator. The Renaissance ideal of the universal man was still achievable. Barely. We don't live in that world anymore. Knowledge has exploded beyond any individual's capacity to master. The scientist understands her narrow field but remains ignorant of history. The novelist reads literature but can't pass a mathematical proof. Specialization isn't a choice but a necessity. The very idea of a Goethean figure, someone who contributes meaningfully to multiple disciplines, seems quaint, impossible. And yet something in us resists total fragmentation. The hunger for synthesis persists. We sense that the silos are a problem, that understanding requires connection across domains. Wolfgang's example suggests a different approach. Not mastery of everything, but a cultivated openness, a willingness to see patterns that transcend disciplinary boundaries. His morphology, flawed as it was scientifically, demonstrated how observation in one field can illuminate another. His poetry drew on his scientific work. His administrative experience shaped his political writings. Everything connected. The digital age offers a strange echo of this. We have access to more information than Wolfgang could have imagined. Entire libraries in our pockets. But access isn't understanding. We skim, we scroll, we accumulate facts without integration. The challenge now isn't finding information, but achieving depth, making connections, building a coherent worldview from the fragments. Wolfgang's method was slow. He revised Faust for 6 decades. He observed plants for years before formulating his theories. He rewrote Wilhelm Meister entirely. This glacial pace feels alien to a culture of instant publishing and viral content, but perhaps that's exactly why it matters. The pressure to produce quickly, to respond immediately, to keep up with the feed, creates a shallow engagement with ideas. Wolfgang's example argues for marination, for letting thoughts develop over time, for resisting the demand for instant conclusions. His notion of renunciation, Entsagung, becomes particularly relevant, not renunciation as self-denial, but as selective focus. You can't do everything, pursue every interest, master every skill. Wilhelm learns this painfully in the Travels. He must choose, commit, accept limits. In an age of infinite options and perpetual FOMO, this might be the most radical idea Wolfgang offers. Depth requires saying no to breadth. Mastery requires abandoning the fantasy of universal competence. But there's a darker reading available. Wolfgang's privilege enabled his self-cultivation. He had wealth, status, institutional support, freedom from material anxiety. How many potential Goethes never got the chance because they were born poor, female, colonized, enslaved? His vision of human development assumes conditions most people have never enjoyed. The criticism stings because it's true. Still, the aspiration needn't be elitist. The core idea that life is a process of growth and transformation, that we shape ourselves through conscious effort and reflection, that our character isn't fixed but malleable. This applies regardless of circumstance. Frederick Douglass, born into slavery, pursued self-education with a hunger Wolfgang would have recognized. Simone de Beauvoir, facing the constraints placed on women, crafted a philosophy of becoming that echoes Bildung while critiquing its gendered assumptions. The ideal can be democratized even if Wolfgang himself didn't fully do so. His influence on education persists in ways we rarely acknowledge. The liberal arts model, the belief that students should encounter multiple disciplines before specializing, the emphasis on critical thinking over rote memorization, the idea that education shapes character, not just skills. All of this descends from the tradition Wolfgang represented. When universities defend the humanities against purely vocational training, they're making a Goethean argument, whether they know it or not. Literature continues to grapple with his legacy. The Bildungsroman remains a living form. Every novel about a young person finding their place in the world, learning through mistakes, maturing through experience, is in conversation with Wilhelm Meister. Contemporary writers update the formula. Zadie Smith's White Teeth, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Americana, Ocean Vuong's On Earth. We're briefly gorgeous. These are Bildungsroman for multicultural, globalized contexts, exploring formation in conditions Wolfgang never imagined, but using structures he helped establish. Faust's afterlife is even stranger. The myth has detached from the text. Most people who reference Faust haven't read Wolfgang's version. They know the basic story, the pact with the devil, but the details come from Marlowe, from opera, from film, from cultural osmosis. And yet Wolfgang's specific interpretation, Faust's salvation, through striving, through never giving up the quest for meaning, that remains embedded in how we understand the story. The idea that ambition itself, even destructive ambition, contains something redemptive if it's paired with genuine seeking. This is Wolfgang's addition to the legend, and it's shaped how modernity thinks about aspiration and its costs. His scientific work presents the most complex legacy. The theory of colours was wrong in its attack on Newton, but wrong in interesting ways. Wolfgang insisted on the subjective experience of colour, on the physiological and psychological dimensions Newton's optics ignored. Modern colour theory vindicates Wolfgang partially. We now understand that colour perception involves not just wavelengths, but neural processing, cultural context, subjective response. Wolfgang was asking questions that 19th century physics couldn't answer, but that 20th century neuroscience and phenomenology could. He was right that Newton's account was incomplete, even if his alternative explanation failed. His morphology, similarly, anticipated later developments. The idea of the Urpflanze, the archetypal plant from which all others derive, was scientifically untenable, but the search for underlying patterns in biological forms, the recognition that developmental processes shape structure, these became central to evolutionary biology and evo-devo. Wolfgang's method of careful observation, his attention to metamorphosis and transformation, his insistence that form and function can't be separated. All of this contributed to a holistic approach to biology that complements reductionist molecular genetics. Climate change gives his nature, writing unexpected urgency. Wolfgang's reverence for the natural world, his sense of humanity's embeddedness in larger systems, his warnings against exploitative instrumentalism, these read differently now. He wasn't an environmentalist in the modern sense, but his insistence on respecting natural limits, on observing before intervening, on recognizing that human cleverness doesn't exempt us from natural law, this feels prophetic. The West Eastern Divan's celebration of gardens, its vision of cultivation that works with nature rather than against it, offers an alternative to the dominance model that's produced ecological crisis. His cosmopolitanism matters in an age of a resurgent nationalism. Wolfgang lived through the Napoleonic Wars, witnessed German nationalism's birth, and consistently refused to subordinate art to political identity. He read Persian poetry, translated French drama, celebrated Italian culture, corresponded with writers across Europe. World literature, Weltliteratur, was his term, his vision of a global conversation transcending national boundaries. In a moment when borders are hardening and cultures are being weaponized, Wolfgang's example of curiosity, about otherness, of learning from foreign traditions while remaining rooted in his own, suggests a way forward. But we have to reckon with the contradictions. He served a duke, supported hierarchical social structures, showed little interest in revolutionary politics. His personal relationships often displayed selfishness, masked as artistic necessity. He abandoned Friederike. He kept Christian in social limbo for years. He could be cold, calculating, self-absorbed. The man was not the ideal the work proposed. Does this matter? It's the perennial question with artists whose personal behaviour disappoints. We want our heroes consistent, their lives matching their insights. Wolfgang forces us to separate the achievement from the achiever, to recognise that profound understanding of human nature doesn't guarantee exemplary personal conduct. The work remains valuable even when the life reveals flaws. Perhaps the most useful thing Wolfgang offers now is simply the example of sustained attention. He looked at plants until he saw patterns no one else noticed. He studied clouds, rocks, bones. He rewrote his masterwork for 60 years. He maintained friendships through decades of correspondence. He paid attention deeply and continuously to the world and to his own development. In an economy designed to fracture attention into ever smaller units, to monetize distraction, to reward the quick take over the considered judgment, this model of deep focus becomes almost countercultural. The letters alone are astonishing. Over 14,000 survive. He wrote to scientists explaining observations, to writers discussing craft, to friends sharing daily life, to admirers he'd never met. The correspondence sustained intellectual community across distance, created networks of exchange that transcended institutional boundaries. It was social media for the 18th century, but slow, thoughtful, demanding sustained engagement. Each letter required composition, reflection, the crafting of ideas into clear prose. The comparison highlights what we've gained in speed and breadth, and what we've lost in depth and care. His daily discipline offers another model. Wolfgang structured his days carefully. Mornings for writing, afternoons for administrative work or scientific observation, evenings for society. He understood that creativity requires routine, that inspiration emerges from regular practice rather than waiting for the muse. This contradicts the romantic myth of the artist as wild genius, unbound by convention. Wolfgang was methodical, professional, treating writing as work that demanded showing up consistently. The results speak for themselves. There's something almost therapeutic in his approach to aging. He didn't rage against physical decline or pretend youth could be maintained. He observed the changes, adjusted his activities, found new interests appropriate to each life stage. The late poetry confronts mortality directly, but without despair. There's acceptance, even curiosity, about the final transformation. For a culture obsessed with youth and terrified of death, this offers an alternative, a way of inhabiting age with dignity and continued engagement. The final years of Faust, composed when Wolfgang was in his 70s and 80s, imagine a different kind of heroism. Not the striving of youth, but the building of community, the reclamation of land from the sea, the creation of a space where people can live freely. Faust's salvation comes not from his pact with the devil or his seduction of Gretchen, but from his final vision of useful work. He dies imagining a future he won't see, a community sustained by collective effort. It's a vision of meaning found in contribution rather than individual glory. This might be Wolfgang's most radical idea, that the point isn't personal transcendence or ultimate knowledge or even great art. The point is participation in ongoing human projects, adding your effort to the collective work of making life more livable, more beautiful, more just. Faust is saved not because he's good, but because he never stops trying, never retreats into cynicism or comfort, keeps engaging with the world's problems, even when solutions prove elusive. We're left with questions Wolfgang would appreciate. How do we cultivate ourselves in conditions of fragmentation? How do we develop depth in an age of surfaces? How do we balance specialization with breadth, commitment with openness, rootedness with cosmopolitanism? How do we age with grace? How do we face mortality? How do we contribute to projects larger than ourselves? Wolfgang doesn't provide answers. He provides an example of someone who took these questions seriously, who organized an entire life around pursuing them, who created works of art and science and thought that continue to provoke and illuminate. The example remains available, waiting for anyone willing to engage with it seriously. On March 22, 1832, Wolfgang woke in his study chair, where he'd fallen asleep the night before. He was 82 years old. His body had been failing for months, but his mind remained active, dictating letters, receiving visitors, discussing the latest scientific discoveries. That morning he complained of cold, asked for the window to be closed, and slipped into delirium. He died just after noon. His last coherent words, according to those present, were "more light." The phrase became instantly famous, interpreted as a final philosophical statement, a call for enlightenment, a summation of a life dedicated to understanding. Whether he actually said it, whether it meant anything beyond a request for the curtains to be opened, we'll never know. The uncertainty is fitting. Wolfgang spent his life resisting simple interpretations. They buried him in Weimar beside Schiller, the friend whose death 27 years earlier had devastated him. The funeral was modest by the standards of what he'd become. No state ceremony, no elaborate monument. The duchy mourned, certainly. Europe's newspapers carried the news. But the man himself had requested simplicity, and his wishes were honoured. The grave remained unmarked for years, just another plot in the ducal vault. The legend began immediately. Within days, accounts of his final moments proliferated, each adding details, shaping the narrative. He became the sage of Weimar, the last universal genius, the embodiment of German culture's highest aspirations. Statues were commissioned, monuments erected. His house became a museum. The pilgrimage site was established. Everything he'd written was collected, analysed, debated. Everything he'd touched became relic. This process of canonization did exactly what Wolfgang had feared. It froze him, turned a living example into dead doctrine. Students were forced to memorize passages from Faust without understanding them. Critics argued over textual minutiae while missing the larger spirit. Nationalists claimed him as proof of German superiority, ignoring his cosmopolitanism. Romantics celebrated the young poet while dismissing the old scientist. Everyone extracted what served their purposes and discarded the rest. The result was a Wolfgang nobody could actually learn from, only venerate. The plaster bust replaced the breathing human. The 20th century treated him roughly. 2 world wars fought partially in his name, or at least justified using the cultural tradition he represented. Made that tradition suspect. How could the nation that produced Wolfgang also produce the Holocaust? The question haunted German intellectuals. Some blamed him directly, finding proto-fascist elements in his work, his aristocratic disdain for democracy, his emphasis on the exceptional individual, his occasional anti-Semitic remarks. Others defended him as a true humanist whose legacy had been perverted. The debate revealed more about the debaters than about Wolfgang, but it made reading him difficult. The ideological weight was crushing. Then a strange thing happened. As the century progressed, as the immediate crisis passed, Wolfgang became less a symbol and more a resource. Scholars started reading the scientific work seriously, discovering that his colour theory, while wrong about physics, contained genuine insights into perception. His morphology anticipated systems thinking in biology. His approach to comparative anatomy influenced evolutionary theory, even as he resisted the idea of evolution. The autodidact who refused specialization turned out to have contributions that specialists could actually use. The letters and conversations published in massive editions revealed someone more complex than any monument suggested. Here was a man who could be petty, vindictive, jealous, who manipulated people, who used his position to settle scores, who was often a difficult friend and worse lover, but also someone capable of extraordinary generosity, who mentored dozens of young writers, who used his influence to protect Jewish intellectuals, who remained curious about everything until the final week of his life. The contradictions didn't resolve into coherence. They just sat there, human and irreducible. Reading him now in the early 21st century feels different than it did even 50 years ago. We're no longer looking for the great man, the genius, the representative of a culture. Those frameworks have collapsed under their own weight, revealed as constructions that obscure more than they illuminate. Instead, we can encounter the work directly, without the mediating mythology. Faust doesn't have to be the greatest drama ever written. It can just be a fascinating, frustrating, endlessly suggestive text that refuses to behave the way dramas are supposed to. The poetry doesn't have to represent the pinnacle of German verse. It can be what it is, sometimes sublime, sometimes wooden, always interesting in its ambitions. The novels offer the most immediate access. If you've never read Wolfgang, start with The Sorrows of Young Werther. Yes, it's melodramatic. Yes, the protagonist is insufferable. That's the point. You're not supposed to admire Werther. You're supposed to recognize the pathology of romantic obsession, to see how beautiful feelings can curdle into destructive narcissism. It's a critique disguised as celebration, which is why it was so widely misunderstood. Then read Elective Affinities, the late novel that takes the chemical metaphor and follows it to its devastating conclusion. 2 married couples whose attractions shift and recombine according to laws they can't control. It's a cold book, deliberately so, asking whether human relationships are fundamentally different from chemical reactions. The question isn't answered. You're left unsettled, which is the intention. The autobiography, Poetry and Truth, shows Wolfgang at his most self-aware and self-mythologizing. He's constructing his own legend, shaping the narrative of his development with full consciousness of what he's doing. This makes it unreliable as biography, but fascinating as self-creation. You watch someone deciding what their life means, selecting details that support the chosen interpretation, quietly omitting what doesn't fit. It's honest about its dishonesty, which creates a strange kind of authenticity. But the scientific writings remain the hardest sell for contemporary readers. We know he was wrong about colours, about plant metamorphosis, about the impossibility of evolution. Why read failed science? Because the failures are interesting. Wolfgang's refusal to accept Newton's optics wasn't ignorance. He'd studied the mathematics, he'd performed the experiments. He rejected the conclusions because they violated his fundamental conviction that nature must be intelligible to direct observation, that truth can't hide behind mathematical abstractions. He was wrong, but the wrongness reveals something about the costs of the scientific revolution, about what we gave up when we accepted that reality might not conform to human intuition. His morphology, the study of organic form, operates on the principle that nature works through transformation of basic patterns. The leaf becomes petal, becomes stamen through continuous variation on a single theme. Every vertebrate skeleton is a modification of the same fundamental structure. He called this the Urpflanze, the primal plant, and the Urtier, the primal animal. Not literal ancestors, but ideal types, patterns that generate diversity through variation. Darwin would later provide the mechanism, natural selection operating on random mutation. But Wolfgang identified the phenomenon, the unity underlying diversity. His method was observation, comparison, patient attention to form. It's pre-modern science, but it's not unscientific. It's a different way of knowing, one that privilege. As synthesis over analysis, pattern recognition over causal mechanism, the colour theory is the most substantial scientific work. Hundreds of pages of experiment, observation, polemic. Wolfgang attacks Newton with genuine fury, accusing him of torturing nature with prisms and dark rooms, of constructing elaborate mathematical fictions to explain simple phenomena. His alternative theory, based on the interaction of light and darkness, on the eye's active role in creating colour, is wrong about physics, but right about perception. Colours do behave differently in lived experience than in spectral analysis. The phenomenology is valid even when the physics isn't. Modern colour science, especially perceptual psychology, has found things to recover from Wolfgang's work. Not the grand theory, but specific observations about how we actually see. What unites all the scientific work is the conviction that nature is whole, that the divisions between disciplines are human impositions, that understanding requires seeing connections rather than isolating variables. This is why he resisted specialization, why he insisted on maintaining breadth even as depth became the standard of serious work. He was trying to preserve something being lost, a way of encountering the world that didn't reduce it to mechanisms and measurements. He failed, obviously. The specialist won. But the attempt left a record of what the alternative looked like. His influence on literature is easier to trace. The Bildungsroman, the novel of education and development, descends directly from Wilhelm Meister. Every story about a young person leaving home, having experiences and returning transformed, owes something to Wolfgang's template. The idea that life is a process of formation, that character develops through encounters with otherness, that maturity means integration rather than rebellion. This is so deeply embedded in Western storytelling that we barely notice it anymore, but it's a specific historical invention, and Wolfgang is largely responsible. The Romantic movement defined itself partly in opposition to him, but it couldn't escape his gravitational pull. Byron, Shelley, Keats all read him. The French Romantics worshipped Werther even as they misread it. Victor Hugo called him the master. Across Europe, young writers imitated his early style, his combination of emotional intensity and natural description. Then they grew up and often rejected him, which he would have understood perfectly. Influence doesn't mean agreement. It means you can't think about certain things without reference to what came before. In music, the connections are obvious. Schubert set dozens of his poems, creating the German art song tradition. Beethoven wrote incidental music for Egmont. Berlioz composed a dramatic symphony based on Faust. Liszt, Schumann, Wagner, Mahler, all engaged with his work. The Faust theme became an obsession, of 19th century composers, generating operas, symphonies, tone poems. They heard in Wolfgang's text something essentially musical, a structure of themes and variations, of development and transformation that paralleled their own art. Philosophy absorbed him differently. Hegel's dialectic, the movement of thesis and antithesis towards synthesis, echoes Wolfgang's morphological thinking, his sense that development proceeds through polarity and reconciliation. Schopenhauer rejected his optimism, but shared his conviction that art provides access to reality unavailable through concepts. Nietzsche admired the late Wolfgang, the man who'd achieved sovereignty over himself, who could say yes to life without illusions. The example mattered more than any specific doctrine. The question that haunts any assessment is whether Wolfgang still matters beyond historical interest. Is there something we need from him, or is he simply a monument we maintain out of cultural habit? The case for continued relevance rests on several points. First, his insistence on wholeness, on resisting fragmentation, speaks to our current condition of hyper-specialization and information overload. We've gained immense analytical power by dividing knowledge into ever smaller domains, but we've lost the ability to see connections, to think systematically about complex problems. Wolfgang's example won't solve this. We can't return to 18th century universalism, but his commitment to maintaining breadth alongside depth, to seeking patterns across disciplines, offers a model we've largely abandoned and might need to recover. Second, his approach to self-cultivation, the patient work of developing capacities over a lifetime, contradicts our culture of instant expertise and performative identity. Wolfgang believed formation took decades, that wisdom couldn't be rushed, that character was built through sustained engagement with difficulty. This is deeply unfashionable. We want quick results, life hacks, transformation through technique. But the problems that actually matter, both personal and collective, don't yield to shortcuts. They require the kind of long-term commitment Wolfgang exemplified. Third, his way of aging, his refusal to retreat into nostalgia or bitterness, his continued openness to new ideas and experiences, his acceptance of physical decline without surrendering intellectual vitality. We're terrible at aging. We either deny it through desperate youth preservation or collapse into resignation. Wolfgang shows a third path, continuing to develop even as capacities diminish, finding new modes of engagement appropriate to each stage. Finally, his insistence that art and science aren't opposed but complementary, that both are ways of attending to reality, that imagination is a cognitive faculty rather than mere fantasy. We've mostly given up on this synthesis, accepting the divorce between humanities and sciences as permanent. But the biggest challenges we face, climate change, technological disruption, social fragmentation, require both analytical rigor and imaginative vision. Wolfgang won't reunite the cultures, but his work demonstrates what their integration looks like. None of this makes him a guide for living or a source of answers. He's too contradictory, too embedded in his historical moment, too personally flawed for that kind of authority. But he remains usable, a resource for thinking about problems that haven't disappeared. The example of a life organized around questions rather than certainties, committed to development rather than achievement, open to revision rather than defending positions. Not the monument, but the living encounter with someone who took seriously the challenge of becoming fully human. That challenge hasn't changed. The conditions have, drastically, but Wolfgang's 82 years of engagement with it still illuminate what's possible when you refuse easy answers and commit to the long work of understanding. The work outlives the worker. That's the pattern with everyone who creates anything lasting. But with Wolfgang it feels especially pronounced because he organized his entire existence around that principle. Not fame, not legacy in the conventional sense, but the patient accumulation of understanding expressed through forms that might endure. He succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. 2 centuries after his death, people still read Faust, still set his poems to music, still argue about his scientific theories, still use his life as a case study in how to develop across 8 decades. But success creates its own problems. The monument obscures the man. The canonical writer becomes assigned reading, which kills more interest than it generated. Teenagers forced to pass Faust in translation rarely emerge grateful for the experience. The poetry gets reduced to quotations stripped of context. The science gets dismissed as the amateur dabbling of someone who should have stuck to literature. The life gets simplified into inspiration or cautionary tale depending on what the biographer needs. What gets lost in this process is the strangeness. Wolfgang was genuinely weird in ways the monument can't accommodate. He believed in morphological archetypes that don't exist. He thought colours were produced by the interaction of light and darkness. He fell catastrophically in love with teenagers when he was in his 70s. He abandoned a promising legal career to become a courtier in a backwater duchy. He spent 2 years in Italy, essentially running away from his responsibilities. He lived openly with a woman for decades before bothering to marry her. None of this fits the image of the wise sage dispensing timeless truths. The strangeness matters because it's where the actual thinking happened. Wolfgang's greatest insights emerged not from following established paths, but from his willingness to pursue questions everyone else considered settled or irrelevant. Why do all flowering plants show the same basic pattern of transformation? Why does colour perception differ so radically from what physics predicts? How can someone maintain creative vitality across an entire lifespan? These weren't the prestigious questions of his era. They were his questions, pursued with a stubbornness that looked like eccentricity to contemporaries. This suggests something about how to actually use his example rather than just admire it. Don't try to be Wolfgang. The universal genius isn't replicable, and the attempt produces dilettantes, but the method is portable. Pay attention to what genuinely interests you rather than what's supposed to be important. Follow questions across disciplinary boundaries even when specialists tell you you're trespassing. Commit to projects that take decades, not because you expect completion, but because the work itself is worthwhile. Revise ruthlessly. Accept that most efforts will fail. Keep going anyway. The final paradox is that Wolfgang matters most where he failed. His colour theory was wrong, but the wrongness revealed something about the limits of purely mathematical approaches to perception. His resistance to evolution was misguided, but it preserved questions about form and development that Darwinism initially ignored. His political quietism was a moral failure, but it allowed him to observe revolutionary enthusiasm and reactionary panic with equal skepticism. Even his personal failures, the abandoned lovers and neglected friends, produced insights about the costs of prioritizing work over relationship. None of this redeems the failures or makes them necessary. Better science would have been better. Better politics would have been better. Better personal conduct would have been better. But given that the failures happened, that they're part of the historical record, the question becomes whether they can still teach something. Wolfgang thought they could. He included his mistakes in the autobiography, dramatized his youthful obsessions in Werther, built Faust's salvation on a lifetime of errors. The examined life includes examining what went wrong, so we're left with questions which is appropriate. Wolfgang spent 82 years asking them. How do we develop understanding that integrates rather than fragments? How do we maintain curiosity when expertise demands narrowing? How do we age without either clinging to youth or surrendering to decline? How do we contribute to projects larger than ourselves without losing individual perspective? How do we accept mortality without denying its reality? No answers, just the example of someone who took the questions seriously enough to organize a life around them. The books remain, difficult and rewarding and occasionally infuriating. The life remains, documented in exhaustive detail, available for study. The influence remains, woven so deeply into Western culture that we inherit it whether we read him or not. What we do with any of this is the question he'd want us to ask ourselves. Not what did Wolfgang think, but what do you think now that you've encountered his thinking? The conversation continues. That was always the point.